Good morning, guys. So last week we talked about ascension and we talked about Jesus going back up to heaven after he had come back after Easter. He spent some time with his friends and then he said, I'm going back up to heaven and I'm going to get a place ready for you. And someday I'm going to come back and I'm going to bring heaven back down here with me. And his friends were sad to see him go, but they remembered as they were leaving that hill where he went up to heaven that he said he would always be with them no matter what. And that's something next week we're going to talk about is how Jesus was going to be with them, even though he wasn't there in body anymore. But this week we're going to backtrack back to after the Noah story we did a few weeks ago. So we're kind of telling the Bible stories in order. Last week we jumped ahead to the Jesus story. But remember, this is long time ago, before Jesus came to earth. And we stopped with the Noah story a couple weeks ago. And so this is the story that kind of happens next. So after the flood recedes and Noah and his sons start their lives all over again, this is what happens. And it's a story about a giant tower. It's a story about people who make a mistake in thinking that they can build a tower that reaches all the way to heaven. They don't think about the promises of God, that God would always be with them. In fact, they want to be like God. And that becomes a problem for them. So we're going to read this story. A giant staircase to heaven. Noah and his family lived in the land, and his children had children. And those children had more children, and those children had even more. Well, you get the picture. Until there were lots of people on the earth once more. Now back then everyone spoke exactly the same language, so you didn't need to learn Swahili or Japanese or anything, because you could say hello to anyone and they would know what you meant. One day, everyone was talking and they came up with an idea. Let's build ourselves a beautiful city to live in. It can be our home and we'll be safe forever and ever. Then they had another idea. And let's build a really tall tower to reach up to heaven. Yes, they said. We'll say, look up at us here, and everyone will look up at us, and we'll look down on them, and then we'll know we are something special. We'll be like God. We'll be famous and safe, and everyone and everything will be all right. So they got to work. Brick by brick, the tower grew higher and higher until it soared above the city, touching the sky. They built stairs in the tower to climb to the top. It was like a giant staircase to heaven. Look, they cheered, we're the ones. See what we can do with our very own hands. They were quite pleased with themselves. But God wasn't pleased with them. God could see what they were doing. They were trying to live without him. But God knew they wouldn't make them happy or safe or anything. If they kept on like this, they would only destroy themselves. And God loved them too much to let that happen. So he stopped their plans. One morning they went to work as usual, but everything was different. Their words were all new and funny. You see, God had given each person a completely different language. Suddenly, no one understood what anyone else was saying. Someone would say, how do you do? And the other person thought they said, how ugly are you? It wasn't funny. You could be saying something nice like such a lovely morning and get a punch in the nose because they thought you said, hush up, you're boring. Couldn't even say pardon to check if you'd heard right because no one understood that word either. It wasn't easy to work together after that, as you can only imagine. People were always quarreling and fighting and getting into a dreadful muddle and becoming grumpier and grumpier until at last they were all too cross to keep on building. And they just had to stop. And after that, people scattered all over the world, which is how we ended up with so many different languages to this day. You see, God knew however high they reached, however hard they tried, people could never get back to heaven by themselves. People didn't need a staircase, they needed a rescuer. Because the way back to heaven wasn't a staircase, it was a person. People could never reach up to heaven. So heaven would have to come down to them. And one day, it would. So that's what we talked about last week. We talked about the story of Jesus and how he came down to die and to rise again, to show us the power he has to stop death, to bring everything into new life. We talked about how he rose up last week. We talked about he ascended back to heaven. He didn't need a tower. He was God, and he could rise in the sky. But he promised that he would bring heaven back down, and he himself had just come down to show us that we didn't need to build a tower. And even now, sometimes to feel safe and secure, we feel like we need to build really big things in our lives. And sometimes God inspires us to do really great things. He made us talented, and he made us strong, and he made us creative, and we can do all kinds of things. But the problem is when we begin to feel like that's all our responsibility, that that's all in our power to do that. And we don't realize that God gives us the gifts that he gives us to do good things, but he also gives us limits to work within. Just like our parents have boundaries, God gives us boundaries. So I thought today for our cooking portion and our crafting portion, I'm going to issue a challenge. And we're going to start a church newsletter this week on Friday. I'll be dropping it off at all your houses, and I want you guys to contribute. So if you do this baking or cooking challenge, what I want you to do is get your mom or dad or whoever you're living with right now to take a picture or to send me your instructions or your recipe you used, and we'll make sure to include pictures of those in our church newsletter. So I was thinking about sunflowers. So here I have a sunflower craft I made. I just made this out of construction paper, and then I used some paper plates and I colored them and I cut leaves. And this is a really cool step I saw online. You take some bubble wrap, and we all have lots of that right now because our moms and dads have been ordering lots of stuff online, and you just paint it. So I painted that black for the center of my sunflowers, but I've also seen people use dried beans that they glue onto the plate. So if you guys want details on that craft, your mom or dad can send us a message, but I'm pretty sure you could find that online, or find some other idea for a sunflower craft, or draw a picture of a sunflower, or make a sunflower out of Lego. That's totally up to you, but I'd love to see what you come up with. And for our cooking challenge here, I have a couple ingredients. Sunflower seed butter. I bought that in the health food aisle at Foodland. It's about $3. And then I bought this big bag of roasted and salted sunflower seeds. So this week, me and my kids are going to try to come up with a recipe that involves those two things. I'd like to see what you come up with. And why I chose sunflowers is because there's so many beautiful flowers out right now. You see people online to get into the garden centers and out planting their gardens. And I'm thinking about a couple years ago when I planted sunflowers and how tall they got. And you look at them and you think, that's beautiful, and God made that. And I can help him grow that. But it has a limit, and it's happy within that limit. It could be 7 feet tall, it could be 8 feet tall, and it feels like it's reaching for the sky. But God limits it to how tall it is. And yet it's still beautiful, and it brings him glory, and it reminds us of his presence in the world. So that's your challenge this week. I'd love to see what you guys come up with. And remember that you yourself is like a sunflower, a beautiful thing God created that reaches for the sky, but stays within the beautiful limits that God gives you.